What if one of Hitler's greatest mistakes wasn't invading the Soviet Union, but refusing to let East Prussia go? That single decision would condemn hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and countless civilians to one of the most terrifying catastrophes of the Second World War. Entire armies would vanish, ancient cities would burn, families would freeze to death on snow-covered roads, and a province that had stood as the proud heart of Prussia for centuries would become an enormous prison, with no escape. To understand why this disaster unfolded, we must first understand what East Prussia truly meant to Adolf Hitler. This was not just another German province marked on a military map. East Prussia was the birthplace of Prussian military tradition, the homeland of generations of officers whose discipline, obedience, and battlefield victories had shaped the German army long before the Second World War. For many Germans, this land represented honor, sacrifice, and military excellence. Castles, barracks, parade grounds, and monuments stood as reminders of centuries of warfare that had built Prussia into one of Europe's most feared military powers. For Hitler, however, East Prussia carried an even deeper meaning. It was sacred ground. He had spent countless hours there at the Wolf's Lair, his massive headquarters hidden beneath dense forests near Rastenburg. From those reinforced bunkers, surrounded by concrete walls, steel doors, and endless security, he had directed some of the largest military operations in history. It was there that victories had once seemed unstoppable. It was also there that the famous assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, nearly ended his life. Because of that personal connection, Hitler viewed East Prussia not merely as territory, but as a symbol of Germany itself. And symbols in his mind could never be surrendered. By late 1944, however, the war had changed beyond recognition. The Wehrmacht that had once stormed across Europe now fought, desperately on every front. Entire divisions had been destroyed in Russia. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition arrived late, if at all. Replacement soldiers were often teenagers, elderly reservists, or wounded veterans sent back into combat before they had fully recovered. Every month, the German army became weaker, while the Red Army grew stronger. Yet, despite reports arriving daily from his generals, Hitler refused to accept reality. Experienced commanders repeatedly warned him that East Prussia could not be defended forever. They argued that the province projected dangerously into Soviet-controlled territory like a giant peninsula of land. If Soviet armored spearheads broke through from the south and east simultaneously, they could cut the province off from the rest of Germany, trapping everyone inside. The military solution seemed obvious. Withdraw while the roads remained open. Pull back to shorter defensive lines. Save the soldiers for the battles that still lay ahead. But Hitler rejected every proposal. Retreat in his eyes was not strategy. It was weakness. He believed that every fortress could be held if the defenders possessed enough determination. Again and again, he ordered commanders to stand fast, promising that fixed defenses, fortified cities, and unwavering resolve would stop the Soviet advance. His orders left little room for discussion. No retreat, no evacuation, no surrender. East Prussia would become a fortress. And a fortress, Hitler declared, never falls. Paper, that confidence appeared impressive. The province contained defensive belts, fortified towns, anti-tank obstacles, concrete bunkers, trenches carved into frozen ground, artillery positions, and experienced officers who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front. Reinforcements continued arriving, while engineers strengthened roads, bridges, and defensive strongpoints throughout the region. To civilians living there, these preparations brought reassurance. Families watched German soldiers digging trenches outside their towns. Freight trains still delivered supplies. Military convoys continued moving through villages. Newspapers promised that the Wehrmacht would defend every inch of German soil. Many wanted to believe those promises. Parents tried to convince frightened children that the front would never reach their homes. Farmers continued tending frozen fields despite hearing distant artillery. Church bells still rang across ancient towns whose streets had remained German for generations. Life, although increasingly tense, continued. Few realized that everything around them stood on the edge of complete collapse. Beyond the forests and frozen rivers, hidden from German civilians, the Soviet Union was assembling one of the most powerful offensive forces ever concentrated against a single region during the war. Thousands of artillery guns were quietly positioned. Columns of T-34 tanks gathered behind the front. Entire armies moved mostly at night to conceal their true strength. Massive stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, food, and engineering equipment accumulated day after day. Railroads carried an endless stream of soldiers toward East Prussia. Soviet commanders studied German defensive maps, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and intelligence reports in extraordinary detail. Every bunker, road junction, railway, and fortified village was carefully analyzed. Bridges were marked as objectives. Weak sectors were identified. Assault units rehearsed their attacks before the offensive even began. The Red Army was not preparing for another limited breakthrough. It was preparing to erase East Prussia as a fighting force. Inside the province, almost no one understood the scale of the danger. German commanders along the front noticed increased Soviet reconnaissance patrols. Artillery fire slowly intensified. Refugees arriving from neighboring regions brought horrifying stories of overwhelming Soviet attacks farther south. Rumors spread through villages, military headquarters, and railway stations. But rumors are easy to dismiss. Reality is much harder. Within weeks, those peaceful roads would become rivers of terrified civilians fleeing through blizzards. Those proud fortifications would become shattered ruins. Those confident promises would disappear beneath relentless artillery fire. And the fortress that Hitler believed could never fall was about to become one of the greatest traps of the Second World War. While Hitler insisted that East Prussia would become an unbreakable fortress, something enormous was taking shape beyond the German front lines. It did not happen overnight. It was built piece by piece, train by train, convoy by convoy, hidden beneath the endless snow-covered forests of the Soviet Union. Every passing day, the Red Army became stronger. Every passing day, Germany became weaker. By the beginning of 1945, the balance of power on the Eastern Front had changed completely. The German invasion that had once reached the gates of Moscow now existed only as a distant memory. The Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was fighting simply to survive. The disaster of Operation Bagration, launched only months earlier in the summer of 1944, had shattered Army Group Center. Entire German corps had disappeared from the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviet Union had not merely pushed the Germans back. It had ripped open the center of the Eastern Front. Now there was only one great German stronghold still standing in the northeast: East Prussia. To Joseph Stalin, capturing the province meant far more than winning another battle. This was the first large piece of Germany itself that the Red Army intended to conquer. For years, German armies had burned Soviet villages, destroyed cities, and left millions dead across Soviet territory. Now the war was crossing into the land from which that invasion had begun. The Soviet High Command understood that history was watching. Failure was not an option. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky and General Ivan Cherniakovsky began preparing an offensive unlike anything East Prussia had ever faced. Their objective was brutally simple: break through the German defenses, isolate the province from the rest of Germany, and destroy every major German force trapped inside. There would be no slow advance. There would be no pause to regroup. The attack would strike with overwhelming force from multiple directions at once. For weeks, Soviet railroads worked without rest. Day and night, locomotives arrived carrying fresh divisions toward the front. Long columns of infantry disappeared into forests, where they waited in silence. Endless convoys of trucks hauled ammunition, fuel, artillery shells, food, bridge-building equipment, medical supplies, and replacement parts for thousands of armored vehicles. Nothing was left to chance. The Red Army had learned painful lessons after years of fighting the Wehrmacht. Earlier in the war, Soviet offensives had often relied on courage alone. Now they relied on experience, planning, and crushing firepower. Every assault was carefully organized. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed German defenses from above. Scouts crawled through the snow at night, measuring minefields and locating machine gun nests. Captured German prisoners were questioned for hours. Engineers studied rivers, frozen marshes, and forests, planning exactly where tanks could pass and where bridges would need to be built. Even the weather became part of the battle plan. The frozen ground would support the weight of heavy tanks that would normally become trapped in mud. Snow would conceal troop movements. Long winter nights allowed entire armies to reposition without being seen by German aircraft. Nature itself had become another weapon. Then came the artillery. The Soviet Union assembled thousands upon thousands of guns along the front, heavy howitzers capable of smashing concrete bunkers, field guns prepared to pulverize trenches, mortars that could blanket entire forests with explosions, Katyusha rocket launchers whose terrifying shriek had become one of the most feared sounds of the Eastern Front. Each weapon had a specific target. Each battery received detailed firing plans. When the offensive began, the bombardment would not simply weaken German defenses. It would attempt to erase them. Behind the artillery waited an even greater force. Columns of T-34 tanks stretched for miles across hidden assembly areas. Heavy IS-2 tanks, armed with massive 122mm guns powerful enough to tear apart bunkers and destroy German armor with a single hit, stood ready beside them. Mechanized infantry prepared to ride into battle on the backs of armored vehicles. Assault engineers sharpened axes, packed explosives, checked flamethrowers, and prepared demolition charges for clearing fortified positions. Entire armies stood waiting for one signal. The numbers were staggering. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers would take part in the offensive against East Prussia, supported by tens of thousands of artillery pieces and mortars, thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, thousands of aircraft ready to dominate the skies. It was not simply an army. It was a machine designed to crush everything in its path. Meanwhile, on the German side of the front, many commanders sensed that something unusual was happening. Reconnaissance patrols reported increased Soviet activity. Radio operators intercepted growing amounts of enemy communications. Frontline observers noticed artillery positions multiplying across the horizon. Railway stations behind Soviet lines never seemed to stop unloading trains. Experienced officers understood exactly what these signs meant. A massive offensive was coming. Some commanders urgently requested permission to shorten their defensive lines before it was too late. Others warned that the province projected dangerously into Soviet-held territory and could easily be surrounded if both flanks collapsed. Again, Berlin refused. Hitler dismissed the warnings as excessive pessimism. He insisted that Soviet strength was being exaggerated. He believed that East Prussia's fortifications, combined with the determination of German soldiers, would stop the attack just as they had done before. But the soldiers standing in frozen trenches could already feel that this time was different. Across the silent white landscape, they watched unfamiliar lights moving at night. They heard distant engines that never seemed to stop. The ground occasionally trembled beneath the weight of unseen armored columns. Even the forests appeared to be coming alive. The enemy was gathering, not for another local assault, not for another probing attack, but for a storm so immense that, once it was unleashed, it would swallow one of Germany's oldest provinces, trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, and turn East Prussia into a battlefield from which very few would ever escape. The morning the offensive began, the men in the German trenches realized something was terribly wrong. It started with silence. Not the ordinary silence of a frozen winter morning, but the heavy, unnatural silence that often comes just before catastrophe. Snow covered the forests, villages, and fields of East Prussia like a white blanket. The bitter wind cut through uniforms already stiff with ice. German sentries stood, watch, scanning the gray horizon through binoculars, unable to see what was waiting beyond the mist. Many had survived Stalingrad. Others had fought at Kursk, Kharkov, and during the long retreat across Belarus. These were veterans who believed they had seen every horror the Eastern Front could produce. They were wrong. Far beyond the German lines, thousands of Soviet artillery pieces were already aimed directly at them. Every gun had been carefully surveyed. Every shell had been stacked in enormous piles. Every target had been assigned days before. At precisely the planned moment, the horizon exploded. A deafening roar shattered the frozen morning as thousands of Soviet guns opened fire at the exact same second. The earth convulsed. The sky vanished beneath black smoke. Within moments, the entire front disappeared under an avalanche of steel and fire. Heavy artillery shells screamed overhead before smashing into German trenches with terrifying force. Concrete bunkers that had taken months to build were ripped apart in seconds. Observation posts collapsed. Telephone poles splintered into flying shards of wood. Entire forests seemed to explode as centuries-old pine trees were torn from the frozen ground. Then came the Katyushas. Their rockets filled the air with the chilling, high-pitched howl that German soldiers had learned to fear long before they ever saw the explosions. The sound was unforgettable. It was as if the sky itself were screaming. Seconds later, dozens of rockets slammed into defensive positions almost simultaneously, throwing walls of dirt, snow, timber, and human bodies high into the freezing air. The bombardment did not stop. Minute after minute, hour after hour, the shells kept coming. German soldiers pressed themselves against the frozen walls of their trenches, covering their helmets with shaking hands. Every explosion showered them with ice, stones, splintered wood, and fragments of steel traveling faster than the eye could follow. Many never saw the shell that killed them. Some bunkers received direct hits that buried entire squads alive beneath concrete and frozen earth. Inside those collapsed shelters, survivors clawed desperately through debris, struggling to breathe as dust filled their lungs. Their screams were drowned out by the endless thunder outside. Communications failed almost immediately. Telephone cables were shredded. Radio antennas snapped apart. Messengers attempting to carry orders across open ground were cut down before traveling 100 meters. Within the first hour, many German commanders no longer knew where neighboring units were, or whether they still existed. Confusion spread faster than the explosions. Some officers believed they were facing only a local attack. Others feared the front had already collapsed. No one possessed a complete picture. That uncertainty was exactly what the Soviet commanders wanted. As the artillery continued pounding the German lines, Soviet aircraft appeared. Overhead, ground attack aircraft flew through the smoke, diving toward roads, bridges, artillery batteries, and supply depots. Bombs crashed into ammunition dumps, sending gigantic fireballs climbing into the winter sky. Trucks carrying fuel erupted into pillars of black smoke that could be seen for miles. Any German vehicle moving in daylight immediately became a target. Horse-drawn wagons overturned. Ambulances burned. Columns attempting to reinforce the front scattered in panic as machine gun. Fire swept across snow-covered roads. Then, through the smoke, the tanks appeared. Dark shapes slowly emerged from the haze. At first there were only a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Rows of T-34s rolled forward with frightening confidence, their wide tracks crushing frozen earth, shattered trees, and abandoned trenches beneath their weight. Behind them came heavy IS-2 tanks, followed by endless waves of Soviet infantry advancing through smoke, snow, and drifting clouds of dust. Their attack had been rehearsed countless times. As soon as the artillery shifted deeper into the German rear, assault troops rushed forward before the defenders could recover. German machine gunners who survived the bombardment desperately opened fire. Anti-tank guns hidden beneath camouflage nets fired at the advancing armor. Panzerfaust teams waited until Soviet tanks came dangerously close before exposing themselves to fire. Some Soviet vehicles burst into flames. Others lost tracks and spun helplessly in place. But for every tank destroyed, another 5 seemed to emerge from the smoke. The sheer weight of the assault became overwhelming. Entire German platoons found themselves fighting enemies from 3 different directions at once. A trench captured in the morning was abandoned by noon. A crossroads defended for hours became surrounded before sunset. Every kilometer of ground cost lives. Snow that had been untouched only hours earlier was now blackened by explosions and stained dark with blood. The wounded lay where they had fallen, many crying for medics who could no longer reach them. Others crawled through shell craters, dragging shattered legs behind them, leaving crimson trails across the ice. Some froze where they lay, their final breaths turning into tiny clouds that vanished into the bitter winter air. Behind the front, civilians heard the bombardment long before they saw the battle. Windows rattled violently. Church bells shook inside their towers. Children covered their ears as the distant thunder rolled across the countryside without pause. Many still believed the German army would stop the attack. After all, East Prussia had always been protected. Its fortifications were famous. Its soldiers were experienced. Its commanders had promised they would hold the line. But by the end of that first terrible day, cracks had already begun to appear, not just in the defensive positions, but in the entire German front. The artillery had not merely destroyed trenches. It had shattered coordination. It had broken communications. It had paralyzed entire divisions before the main Soviet assault had even reached them. And as darkness settled over the frozen battlefield, one terrible truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The battle for East Prussia had begun, and the fortress Hitler believed could never fall was already starting to break apart. By the second day of the offensive, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary Soviet attack. The German front was not bending, it was breaking. Entire sectors that had held firm for months were suddenly disappearing from military maps. Defensive positions that officers had believed could withstand weeks of fighting were being overrun in a matter of hours. Reports arriving at headquarters became increasingly desperate, each one painting a darker picture than the last. Enemy tanks have broken through. We've lost contact with the regiment on our left. Our ammunition is almost gone. We are surrounded. Then, silence. One by one, radio stations stopped answering. Entire battalions simply vanished. The officers trying to coordinate the defense found themselves staring at maps that no longer matched reality. Units marked as holding villages had already been destroyed. Roads shown as open were now occupied by Soviet armor. Reinforcements sent to stabilize the line drove directly into enemy spearheads that had advanced much farther than anyone believed possible. The battlefield had dissolved into chaos. For the German infantrymen trapped at the front, every hour became a fight for survival. Many had barely slept in days. Their uniforms were soaked from melting snow and stiff with frozen mud. Their boots were worn through after years of marching across Russia. Some had only a handful of rifle cartridges left. Others shared machine gun belts because replacement ammunition had failed to reach them. Still, they fought. Every ditch became a firing position. Every farmhouse became a bunker. Every frozen tree line became another desperate attempt to slow the Soviet advance. Veteran, non-commissioned officers barked orders through the roar of artillery, trying to keep frightened young recruits from abandoning their positions. Many of those recruits had never experienced combat before. Only weeks earlier, they had been attending school or working in factories. Now they found themselves staring at endless waves of Soviet soldiers advancing through smoke and snow. Some froze in terror. Others fired until their rifles became too hot to hold despite the freezing air. Many never lived long enough to reload. The Soviet assault never seemed to stop. Whenever one attack was repelled, another appeared. Behind the first wave came a second. Behind the second came a third. Fresh Soviet battalions continuously replaced exhausted units. while the Germans had almost no reserves left to plug the growing gaps. The difference in manpower was becoming impossible to ignore. For every German platoon reduced to a few exhausted survivors, entire Soviet companies continued advancing. The pressure became relentless. German anti-tank guns knocked out several T-34s along a narrow forest road. Burning tanks blocked the advance, and for a brief moment it looked as though the line might hold. Then, Soviet engineers moved forward under covering fire. Ignoring exploding shells and machine gun bullets, they dragged the wrecks aside, filled anti-tank ditches, cleared minefields, and opened new paths through the forest. Within minutes, more tanks rolled through. It was as though the attack could not be stopped, only delayed. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, could offer little help. Fuel shortages had grounded many aircraft. Those that managed to take off often found themselves hopelessly outnumbered by Soviet fighters controlling the skies. German pilots fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could not replace aircraft that no longer existed. Above the battlefield, Soviet planes circled almost without interruption. They hunted anything that moved: a truck carrying wounded soldiers, a horse pulling an ammunition wagon, a column of refugees escaping west. Nothing was safe. Every road became a killing ground. Meanwhile, inside German headquarters, panic slowly replaced confidence. Telephone operators struggled to reconnect broken communication lines only to watch them disappear again beneath fresh artillery fire. Staff officers raced from room to room, carrying handwritten reports because radio networks had collapsed. Maps were covered with new markings every few minutes as Soviet breakthroughs multiplied across the front. Some commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw to shorter defensive positions before complete encirclement became inevitable. The answer from Berlin remained exactly the same: hold your ground, no retreat, not one step back. Those orders, issued hundreds of kilometers away, ignored the reality unfolding. In the snow, a division ordered to hold often no longer existed. Entire companies had been reduced to a dozen men. Officers commanded units made up of survivors from 5 or 6 different regiments who had never fought together before. Supply trucks could no longer reach them. Field kitchens disappeared. Medical stations were abandoned. The organized army that had once conquered half of Europe was slowly fragmenting into isolated groups of exhausted soldiers, simply trying to stay alive until nightfall. Then another disaster struck: the roads. Every available route leading west became hopelessly congested. Military convoys collided with civilian wagons. Horse-drawn carts packed with families mixed with retreating artillery batteries, ambulances, fuel trucks, and columns of marching infantry. Children cried from exhaustion. Horses collapsed into the snow after days without proper food. Drivers abandoned broken vehicles where they stopped, creating massive traffic jams stretching for kilometers. These roads had become the arteries keeping East Prussia alive. Now they were choking shut. The Soviet Air Force quickly recognized the opportunity. Attack aircraft repeatedly struck the crowded columns. Bombs exploded among tightly packed vehicles. Machine guns swept across frozen roads. Panic spread instantly. Horses bolted in every direction. Burning fuel ignited nearby wagons. Soldiers scrambled into roadside ditches while civilians searched desperately for missing family members. Amid smoke, screaming, and shattered wood. For many refugees, the front line was no longer somewhere in the distance. The war had arrived beside them. Back at the front, German officers noticed an even more alarming development. The Soviet breakthroughs were no longer isolated. They were beginning to connect. Armored spearheads advancing from different directions were moving faster than expected, threatening to slice deep behind the German defenses. If they linked together, East Prussia would be cut off from the rest of Germany. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of civilians, entire hospitals, supply depots, airfields, ports, everything inside the province would become trapped. Some commanders immediately understood what this meant. They had seen it before, at Stalingrad, at Korsun, at Cherkasy. The Red Army was not simply pushing the Germans backward. It was building another giant encirclement. And this time, the trap was closing around an entire province. The German commanders had finally understood the danger. The Soviet attack was no longer aimed simply at breaking the front. It was aimed at cutting East Prussia off from Germany. And now, the Red Army was moving with terrifying speed. The German map was beginning to change hour by hour. Soviet arrows that had once seemed separated were now racing toward one another. From the south, Soviet forces pushed through the German defenses. From the east, another massive attack threatened the province. Behind those spearheads came tanks, artillery, engineers, and endless columns of infantry. The objective was simple: reach the Baltic, cut the roads, cut the railways, sever the province, trap everyone inside. For the German soldiers still fighting on the front line, the meaning of those movements was horrifying. If the Soviets reached the coast, there would be no land route back to Germany. East Prussia would become an island surrounded by the Red Army, and the men defending it would be trapped on the wrong side of the battlefield. The first signs appeared along the roads. German units attempting to retreat west suddenly discovered that important routes had already been cut. A convoy would move through a forest believing the road was safe, only to encounter Soviet tanks emerging from the trees. A motorcycle messenger sent to contact another regiment would disappear. A supply column would arrive at a crossroads and find it occupied by Soviet infantry. Sometimes the Germans did not even know the enemy was there until the first machine gun burst tore through the vehicles. The battlefield had become a maze. German commanders desperately tried to understand where the Soviet spearheads were, but reconnaissance was becoming almost impossible. Snowstorms reduced visibility. Soviet fighters controlled much of the sky. Radio communications were unreliable, and every hour that passed allowed the Soviet forces to penetrate deeper. Then, the armored columns began appearing behind German positions. T-34 tanks moved along secondary roads and through forests that German planners had considered difficult for large formations to cross. Engineers worked under fire to clear mines and repair bridges. When bridges had been destroyed, Soviet engineers built temporary crossings. When roads were blocked, they pushed vehicles through fields. When German resistance slowed the advance, artillery was brought forward, and the position was hammered until it collapsed. The Soviet advance had become a moving wall. German units caught between the spearheads faced an impossible choice: fight, withdraw, or be destroyed. Some formations attempted to retreat before the trap completely closed. They moved west through freezing darkness, abandoning heavy equipment that could no longer be transported. Artillery pieces were left beside roads. Damaged tanks were blown up by their own crews rather than allowing them to fall intact into Soviet hands. Ammunition trucks were emptied. Fuel was rationed. Everything unnecessary was abandoned. The German army was becoming lighter, but it was also becoming weaker. Every kilometer of retreat meant leaving behind another piece of the army that had once invaded the Soviet Union, and Hitler still demanded resistance. From headquarters came orders insisting that important towns and crossroads be defended at all costs. Some positions were declared fortresses. That meant the troops inside them were expected to remain even when surrounded. For soldiers already watching Soviet tanks move around their flanks, such orders sounded less like strategy and more like a death sentence. Yet they obeyed. They had little choice. In several sectors, German troops launched violent counterattacks against Soviet spearheads attempting to break through toward the Baltic. Panzer units struck exposed Soviet formations. German infantry followed behind the tanks, attempting to close gaps and recover lost ground. For a brief moment, some attacks succeeded. Soviet tanks burned beside roads. German artillery smashed advancing infantry. Machine guns cut down Soviet troops attempting to cross open fields. But every German success came at an enormous price. The Red Army possessed reserves. The Germans did not. A Soviet unit that suffered heavy casualties could be replaced. A German unit that lost hundreds of men often received no replacement at all. That difference would eventually decide the fate of East Prussia. The Soviet commanders understood another crucial fact. They did not necessarily need to destroy every German unit immediately. They only needed to cut the roads behind them. Once the supply routes were severed, the trapped German formations would slowly become incapable of continuing the fight. Food would disappear. Ammunition would run low. Fuel would become almost non-existent. Wounded men would overwhelm hospitals. And eventually, the trapped army would begin starving. The first major cuts through the German transportation network therefore created something more dangerous than a battlefield defeat. They created isolation. Railway lines leading west were interrupted. Road junctions changed hands. Bridges were destroyed or captured. German trains carrying ammunition were forced to turn around or abandon their routes. The province was beginning to suffocate. Then came the civilians. They had been watching the military situation deteriorate for days. At first, many had refused to leave. Their homes had belonged to their families for generations. Their farms, churches, businesses, and villages represented an entire way of life. Leaving meant abandoning everything, but now Soviet troops were getting closer. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. A village had fallen. Another had been evacuated. A nearby road was under artillery fire. A Soviet tank column had been seen only a few kilometers away. People began packing. They loaded whatever they could carry onto wagons and carts. Blankets, food, clothing, documents, children, the old and the sick. Some families left with almost nothing. Others attempted to take entire households with them. Soon the roads westward were filled with people, and they were moving directly into the same narrowing corridors needed by the German military. The province was becoming one enormous human traffic jam. Soldiers moved west. Refugees moved west. Wounded men moved west. Horse carts moved west. Military trucks moved west. Everyone was trying to escape the same advancing army, but there was only a limited number of roads, and the Red Army was closing them one by one. By now, German officers could see the terrible shape of the disaster. The Soviet forces were approaching the Baltic from multiple directions. If they succeeded, East Prussia would be completely isolated. There would be no land corridor, no easy retreat, no second line waiting safely behind them. Only the Baltic Sea, and behind the Germans, the Red Army, the province Hitler had promised would become an impregnable fortress, was turning into a gigantic pocket. Hundreds of thousands of people were still inside, and the walls of the prison were being built in real time, with tanks, with artillery, with blood, and with every road the Soviets captured. The moment the Soviet forces reached the Baltic was the moment East Prussia ceased to be a province connected to Germany. It became a trap. For the German soldiers still fighting inside, the geography of the disaster was brutally simple. To the east and south stood the Red Army. To the west lay the Baltic Sea, and the narrow coastal routes still under German control. Behind them, the roads to the rest of Germany were disappearing. Hundreds of thousands of people were now trapped inside an increasingly shrinking battlefield, and there was nowhere safe to go. The German military situation deteriorated with frightening speed. Units that had once received regular supplies were now dependent on whatever ammunition. Food and fuel remained inside the pocket. Every shell fired had to be counted. Every liter of fuel became precious. Vehicles that broke down were often abandoned because there was no time or spare parts to repair them. The wounded faced an even worse reality. Field hospitals became overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked in freezing buildings with inadequate supplies, treating men with shattered limbs, burns, bullet wounds, and horrific artillery injuries. Many patients could not be evacuated because the roads were under attack. Some hospitals were forced to move repeatedly as Soviet troops advanced. Medical personnel loaded wounded soldiers onto trucks, wagons, ambulances, and anything else capable of moving. Then they had to move again and again. There was no stable rear anymore. The rear had disappeared. Everywhere was becoming the front. In the towns, fear was spreading. People who had spent their entire lives believing that East Prussia was protected by the German army were now hearing artillery fire approaching from the horizon. The sound became a constant presence, day and night, sometimes distant, sometimes frighteningly close. Windows shook. Buildings trembled. The sky glowed orange at night from burning villages and ammunition depots. Smoke hung over the countryside, and on the roads, the human exodus grew larger. Families fled westward in horse-drawn wagons, carrying children beneath blankets to protect them from the freezing wind. Elderly people were placed on the carts because they could no longer walk. Mothers carried infants against their chests while trying to keep moving through deep snow. Many had no idea where they were going. They simply knew they had to keep moving. The roads were packed so tightly that columns could barely advance. A broken wagon could stop hundreds of people behind it. A dead horse could block an entire road. A destroyed bridge could force thousands to turn around, and every delay was dangerous. Soviet aircraft attacked the roads whenever weather permitted. Low-flying aircraft appeared suddenly through the clouds, firing machine guns and rockets into the columns. Vehicles burned. Horses panicked. People threw themselves into ditches. Children screamed as explosions tore through the wagons around them. When the aircraft disappeared, the survivors emerged from the snow and smoke and continued moving. There was no time to stop, no time to mourn. The Soviet advance was still coming. For German soldiers, the refugee columns created another terrible problem. They needed the same roads to move ammunition and reinforcements, but the roads were full of civilians. German officers attempted to organize traffic, separating military vehicles from refugee columns whenever possible. Yet the sheer scale of the movement made control increasingly difficult. Some roads became so congested that soldiers abandoned their vehicles and continued on foot. Others drove through fields, leaving deep tracks in the frozen ground. Horse teams collapsed from exhaustion. Some animals simply lay down and died in the snow. Their owners had no choice but to leave them behind. The same was happening to military equipment. German artillery pieces that could not be towed were abandoned. Trucks ran out of fuel. Tanks with mechanical failures were destroyed. A vehicle that had been worth thousands of marks only months earlier could become worthless in a matter of minutes. The German army was being stripped of its mobility, and mobility was exactly what a trapped army needed most. Inside the pocket, commanders began facing impossible decisions. Which town should be defended? Which road should remain open? Where should reserves be sent? Which units could be sacrificed to slow the Soviet advance? There were no good answers. Every decision meant leaving someone else exposed. A battalion sent north could save one corridor while allowing another to collapse. A reserve formation committed to one battle might be destroyed before reaching the next. And because Hitler continued demanding that major positions be held, commanders often could not simply withdraw when the tactical situation demanded it. The result was catastrophic. German formations became scattered. Some were pushed toward the coast. Others became isolated inside towns. Some units fought their way westward, only to discover that the route behind them had already been cut. Others found themselves surrounded without even realizing it, until Soviet artillery began firing from behind. The German soldiers were no longer fighting a conventional front. They were fighting in all directions. One moment they faced Soviet infantry across a field. The next, shells fell from their flank. Then a tank appeared behind them. Then radio contact disappeared. The concept of front was beginning to lose its meaning. There was no longer a clear line separating friend from enemy. There were pockets of German resistance scattered across a battlefield that was shrinking every day, and the Soviet forces were tightening the pressure. They captured roads. They seized bridges. They cut railway lines. They pushed toward ports. They isolated towns. Then they attacked again. Each advance reduced the space available to the Germans. The trapped population grew increasingly desperate. Food became harder to obtain. Stores emptied. Livestock disappeared. Families began surviving on whatever they had managed to carry with them. For many soldiers, rations were reduced. For civilians, hunger became a constant fear. The winter itself was merciless. Temperatures plunged at night. Snow covered the roads. Wind swept across open fields, cutting through coats and uniforms. Men who had spent hours fighting in the snow could barely feel their hands. Frostbite became another enemy. A soldier might survive artillery fire and bullets only to lose the ability to walk because his feet had frozen inside his boots. For refugees, the danger was even greater. Many traveled for days with little rest. Children became weak. Elderly people could no longer keep pace. Some collapsed beside the road. Others were loaded onto wagons already overflowing with belongings. The columns continued west because stopping meant facing the Red Army, and the Red Army was getting closer. By now, East Prussia had become a gigantic battlefield, populated by soldiers and civilians trapped together in the same shrinking space. The German army was surrounded. The civilians were surrounded. The wounded were surrounded. Even the roads were surrounded. And yet the most horrifying part of the disaster had not happened yet. The Soviet forces were preparing to close the remaining escape routes. Once those final corridors disappeared, hundreds of thousands of people would be forced toward a handful of ports and coastal positions. For the soldiers, that meant a fight with their backs against the Baltic. For the civilians, it meant a desperate race toward the sea. And for everyone trapped inside East Prussia, the road ahead was becoming shorter with every passing hour. For the civilians of East Prussia, the war had finally arrived. For years, the Eastern Front had seemed like something that happened far away, beyond their villages and farms. They had heard reports of battles hundreds of kilometers away. They had seen wounded soldiers arriving by train. They had watched military convoys disappear toward the east. But their homes had remained standing. Their churches still had roofs. Their farms still had animals. Their children still went to school. That illusion was now gone. The Red Army was advancing into East Prussia, and suddenly, the question was no longer whether the German army could defend the province. The question was whether these families could escape before the roads disappeared. At first, many refused to leave. They had been told repeatedly that the Wehrmacht would hold the line. German propaganda had insisted that the enemy would be stopped. Officials encouraged civilians to remain calm. Some families believed it. Others simply could not imagine abandoning everything they owned. But then, the distant artillery became louder and louder. The horizon began glowing at night. Smoke rose over villages. Refugees from areas farther east arrived carrying stories that terrified everyone who listened. They spoke of destroyed homes, burning villages, endless Soviet columns, the sound of tanks. People who had never thought about fleeing suddenly began packing. But what do you take when you believe you may never see your home again? A family might have only a few hours. They loaded blankets, food, clothing, documents, photographs, whatever money they possessed. Some took jewelry. Others grabbed family Bibles, letters, or small objects that had belonged to their parents. These things had almost no practical value. But when everything else was being lost, people desperately tried to carry pieces of their old lives with them. Then came the children. They were wrapped in layers of clothing and placed inside wagons. Some were too young to understand why their parents were suddenly terrified. They asked when they would come home. Their parents often had no answer. Older children helped carry bags. Mothers held babies close beneath coats. Fathers tried to control horses while constantly looking over their shoulders toward the east. The roads began filling. At first there were dozens of wagons, then hundreds, then thousands. Soon, the column stretched for kilometers. The landscape became almost surreal. Snow covered the ground. Trees stood black against the white horizon. Horse-drawn wagons moved slowly along frozen roads. Military trucks passed among them. Artillery pieces rolled toward the front while refugees traveled in the opposite direction. Ambulances carried wounded soldiers. German infantry marched west on foot. And somewhere behind all of them, the Soviet army was advancing. The greatest danger was not always visible. It was the cold. Temperatures could fall far below freezing, and the wind made the journey even more brutal. The refugees were not equipped for a military evacuation. Many had ordinary winter clothing. Some had blankets. Few had enough food for a journey lasting several days. They traveled anyway. A wagon could become a lifeline. Inside, children huddled together beneath blankets while adults sat exposed to the freezing air. When horses became exhausted, the entire wagon stopped, and when one wagon stopped, dozens behind it were forced to stop as well. Soon the roads became enormous traffic jams. People waited for hours in the cold. There were no hotels, no heated shelters, no reliable medical services, just snow, darkness, and the sound of war approaching. Some refugees became separated from their families in the chaos. A child could disappear among hundreds of people. A wagon could be pushed away from the main column. An elderly relative could become too weak to continue. Families sometimes had only seconds to decide whether to keep moving or stay behind. Those decisions would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Then, the Soviet aircraft arrived. The sound of engines suddenly came from above. People looked toward the sky. Some tried to hide beneath wagons. Others threw themselves into snow-covered ditches. German soldiers shouted warnings. Then machine guns opened fire. Aircraft swept low over the roads. Explosions erupted among the tightly packed columns. Horses screamed and broke loose. Wagons overturned. People ran in every direction. A single attack could transform an organized refugee column into chaos within seconds, and when the aircraft disappeared, there was no safe place to remain. The survivors gathered whatever they could find and continued west. They stepped around destroyed vehicles. They climbed over broken wagons. They searched desperately for missing relatives. Some never found them. The roads became memorials, without graves. The dead were often left beside the route because there was simply no time to stop. The living had to continue because the Soviet army was still coming. Meanwhile, German soldiers were experiencing their own nightmare. Many units had been ordered to protect the retreat routes. They fought delaying actions around villages and crossroads while civilians passed behind them. For these soldiers, every minute mattered. If they could hold a road for another hour, thousands of civilians might escape. If they lost it too quickly, the road could be cut and the entire column trapped. This created scenes of extraordinary desperation. German infantry dug positions beside roads while refugees passed behind them. Machine guns were set up near farmhouses. Anti-tank teams waited for Soviet armor. Artillery fired toward advancing Soviet units, while civilians disappeared into the darkness behind the German lines. The soldiers knew what was happening. They could see the fear in the faces of the people they were supposed to protect, but they also knew that the enemy was approaching rapidly. When Soviet tanks appeared, the German defenders fired. The explosions shook the roads. Burning vehicles illuminated the snow. Infantry fought from ditches and ruined buildings. Sometimes the Germans managed to stop the attack. Sometimes they were forced backward, and every retreat meant the civilians had to move faster. By now, the psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. People had spent days traveling through freezing conditions without knowing whether the next town would still be controlled by German troops. They heard contradictory rumors. One moment, someone claimed the army had defeated the Soviets. Minutes later, another person would shout that the road ahead had been cut. No one knew what was true. The only certainty was movement. Keep going west. Keep going toward the coast. Keep going away from the artillery. For many families, East Prussia was already lost. They simply did not know it yet, and ahead of them waited the Baltic Sea. The sea looked like salvation. Ships could carry people away from the battlefield. Ports could provide an escape route. The western coast became the destination for hundreds of thousands of desperate people. But there was a terrible problem. The Soviet army knew exactly where they were going, and the closer the refugees came to the coast, the fewer roads remained open. East Prussia was shrinking. The military pocket was tightening. The civilian columns were becoming more crowded, and behind them, the Red Army continued advancing through the frozen countryside. For these families, the war was no longer about politics, ideology, or military strategy. It was about survival. A mother trying to keep her children warm. A father trying to keep his horse alive. An elderly man trying to remain with his family. A wounded soldier trying to reach a port. Thousands upon thousands of people moving through snow and darkness toward a coastline they hoped would save them. But the road to the Baltic would become one of the most desperate escape routes of the entire war. And before the end, many would discover that reaching the sea did not necessarily mean reaching safety. By now, German commanders understood the terrible truth. East Prussia was being strangled. The Soviet advance had cut major routes, isolated German formations, and pushed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians toward the Baltic coast. The province that Hitler had called a fortress was becoming a prison. But there was still one possibility: break through, reopen a corridor to the west, reconnect the trapped forces with the rest of Germany before the Soviet ring became impossible to penetrate. It would require something the Wehrmacht possessed very little of by this stage of the war: fresh troops, fuel, ammunition, tanks, and time. They had almost none of them. Nevertheless, German commanders prepared counterattacks. The orders were simple: hit the Soviet spearheads, destroy the forces blocking the escape routes, capture the roads and junctions, open a corridor, then move as many men and civilians through it as possible. On the maps inside German headquarters, the plan looked almost reasonable. On the frozen battlefield, it was something else entirely. It meant sending exhausted soldiers directly against a Red Army that possessed enormous reserves. German armored formations gathered wherever vehicles could still move. Panzer crews checked engines in freezing conditions. Mechanics worked with numb hands, attempting to keep aging vehicles operational. Fuel was rationed so severely that some tanks could not be moved until the exact moment of attack. Every remaining shell mattered. Every tank mattered. Every trained soldier mattered. There would be no replacement if they were lost. The men knew it. The commanders knew it, and yet they attacked. Before dawn, German artillery opened fire. The darkness flashed, orange as guns struck Soviet positions. For a brief moment, the battlefield seemed to belong to Germany again. Then the German tanks moved forward. Their tracks crushed the frozen ground as infantry followed behind. The objective was a Soviet-held road junction, controlling one of the remaining routes through the pocket. The first German attack achieved surprise. Soviet forward positions were overwhelmed. Machine gun nests were destroyed. Several defensive trenches were captured. German infantry moved through the smoke, while tanks fired at Soviet positions from close range. For a few hours, the corridor seemed possible. Then the Soviet response arrived. It came with artillery. Massive concentrations of Soviet guns opened fire against the advancing German formations. Shells exploded around the tanks. Snow and earth erupted into the air. Infantrymen disappeared beneath blasts. German vehicles were struck from the sides. Some tanks burned. Others stopped after losing tracks. The surviving crews continued fighting. They could not afford to stop. Behind them were thousands of soldiers and civilians waiting for the road to open. The German attack pushed forward again, but Soviet reserves were already moving toward the threatened sector. Fresh infantry appeared. Anti-tank guns were positioned along the roads. Tanks moved into blocking positions. The Germans had broken through the first defensive line. Now they were facing the second, and behind it, the third. The Red Army had depth. The Germans did not. This became the defining problem of every German counterattack. A local victory could be achieved. A Soviet trench could be captured. A village could be retaken. A German tank unit could destroy enemy armor. But none of those successes solved the larger problem. The Soviets could bring more forces. The Germans could not. The German commanders were trying to punch a hole through a wall that was constantly rebuilding itself. Still, they continued. The fighting became brutal. In forests, German infantry fought Soviet soldiers at extremely close range. Grenades exploded inside trenches. Machine guns fired through smoke. Buildings changed hands repeatedly. A farmhouse might be German in the morning, Soviet by afternoon, and German again before night. There was no clean battlefield. There were only ruins, snow, smoke, and exhausted men. German soldiers fought until their ammunition was almost gone. Some carried captured Soviet weapons after their own rifles became damaged. Others moved forward with Panzerfausts, waiting desperately for Soviet tanks to come within range. When a Soviet tank appeared, the German soldier had only seconds. He waited. The tank approached. The ground shook beneath its tracks. Then the Panzerfaust fired. A violent flash, a cloud of smoke. Sometimes the tank exploded. Sometimes it kept coming. The difference between survival and death could be measured in meters. Meanwhile, German artillery units were suffering the same shortage of ammunition that plagued the entire pocket. Gunners were ordered to conserve shells. Some batteries could fire only a few rounds before falling silent. Others had ammunition but no fuel to move their guns. A weapon that could not be moved was eventually abandoned. The Soviet artillery, by comparison, seemed almost endless. Whenever German forces concentrated for an attack, Soviet guns responded. The Germans were constantly forced to attack under fire. The counteroffensives began, consuming the very forces needed to maintain the defense. Veteran soldiers disappeared. Tank crews were killed. Officers fell. Experienced NCOs, the men who kept frightened young soldiers moving, were lost in the first minutes of many attacks. The replacements were increasingly inexperienced, and every casualty made the next battle harder. Still, the Germans managed to achieve several local successes. Some Soviet units were pushed back. Certain roads were temporarily reopened. Small corridors appeared. For a brief period, men and civilians could move through them. But these openings were fragile. The Soviet command immediately reacted. Artillery shifted. Reserves were brought forward. Armored formations counterattacked. The corridor narrowed again, then disappeared. The Germans tried once more, and again, and again. Each attack became more desperate. The objective was no longer victory. It was time. One more hour, one more day, one more road kept open, one more column of wounded, evacuated, one more group of civilians moved toward the coast. That was the true purpose of the German counterattacks. They were buying time with blood. Every kilometer of ground gained cost men who could not be replaced. Every kilometer lost brought the Red Army closer to the trapped population. The battlefield became a terrible calculation. How many men could be sacrificed to keep the route open? How many tanks could be lost? How much ammunition remained? How long before the next Soviet assault? There was no easy answer, and above all of it remained Hitler's refusal to accept a strategic withdrawal. Instead of abandoning East Prussia and saving the surviving forces, German formations were repeatedly ordered to counterattack and hold ground. The soldiers at the front paid the price. They fought in snow. They fought in darkness. They fought among burning villages. They fought with frozen hands and empty stomachs. They watched comrades disappear beneath artillery explosions. And still, they were ordered forward. But the Soviet ring was becoming stronger. Every German attack weakened the defenders further. Every Soviet counterattack closed another opening. The corridor the Germans desperately needed was becoming smaller and smaller. Soon, the soldiers trapped inside East Prussia would have to face an even worse reality. The land routes were almost gone. The army could no longer save everyone, and the only remaining path toward Germany would lead to the Baltic Sea. The German counterattacks had failed to reopen a permanent corridor. The trap was complete. Now the war inside East Prussia entered its most brutal phase. There would be no clean front line anymore, no safe rear, no easy retreat. German soldiers would fight from forests, villages, trenches, railway stations, and the ruins of cities, while Soviet artillery hammered everything that remained standing. The Red Army was closing in from every direction. And in the middle of this collapsing battlefield stood hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians who had nowhere left to go. The fighting became increasingly close. In villages across East Prussia, German defenders transformed houses, barns, churches, and railway buildings into improvised strongpoints. Machine guns were positioned behind windows. Anti-tank teams waited beside narrow roads. Artillery observers climbed church towers and watched Soviet columns approaching through the snow. When Soviet infantry entered a village, the fighting could become almost hand-to-hand. A building would be hit by artillery. The roof would collapse. Smoke would fill the rooms. German soldiers would retreat into the cellar. Soviet infantry would enter through the shattered doorway. Grenades would follow. Then the defenders would emerge from another building and counterattack. The same street could change hands several times in a single day. There was nothing clean or heroic about this kind of warfare. It was exhausting, terrifying, and brutally intimate. Men fought only meters apart. A soldier could spend hours hiding behind a wall while artillery shook the ground beneath him, knowing that the next explosion might bury him alive. Wounded men crowded into makeshift aid stations. Doctors worked under terrible conditions, often without enough blood, medicine, anesthetic, or even proper light. Many wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. The roads were too dangerous. The vehicles were too few. The Soviet advance was too fast. For them, being wounded did not necessarily mean safety. It could mean being left behind. And outside the towns, the same disaster was unfolding among civilians. The refugee columns continued moving toward the Baltic. They traveled through snow and freezing darkness, carrying whatever remained of their possessions. But the roads were becoming increasingly dangerous. Soviet aircraft attacked whenever conditions allowed. Artillery fire reached roads once considered safe. And behind the refugees came the German army, retreating toward the same coastal areas. Everyone was being pushed toward the same narrow strip of land. The Baltic Sea was becoming the final destination. But first stood Königsberg. The capital of East Prussia was more than a city. It was a symbol, a city with centuries of Prussian history behind it. And Hitler had declared it a fortress. That meant the defenders were expected to hold it regardless of the circumstances. By early April 1945, Königsberg was surrounded. The Soviet forces had concentrated enormous amounts of artillery around the city. Heavy guns prepared to smash the defensive belts. Soviet infantry and assault engineers gathered for the final attack. Inside Königsberg, German soldiers prepared for the inevitable. The city had been transformed into a fortress. Roads were blocked. Barricades were constructed. Defensive positions occupied buildings and forts. The defenders knew what was coming. Then, on April 6th, the Soviet assault began. The WW2 bombardment was immense. Heavy artillery pounded German positions. Shells crashed into buildings. Streets disappeared beneath smoke and rubble. The sky above Königsberg turned dark with explosions. Soviet infantry advanced behind the artillery barrage while engineers cleared obstacles and breached defensive positions. German defenders resisted fiercely. Machine guns fired from ruined buildings. Artillery struck Soviet concentrations. German troops launched counterattacks against Soviet units that had penetrated the defensive belts. But the Soviet forces possessed overwhelming superiority. They attacked systematically. Fort after fort was surrounded. Defensive positions were isolated. Soviet assault groups moved through the city, fighting from building to building. The battle became a nightmare of rubble and fire. A city that had survived centuries of European history was being destroyed in days. Buildings burned, streets filled with debris. Civilians hid underground while artillery shook the foundations above them. German soldiers fought until their positions became untenable. On April 9, 1945, the commander of the Königsberg garrison, General Otto Lasch, surrendered the city. Hitler regarded the surrender as treason, but the reality was already beyond his control. Königsberg had fallen, and with it, one of the most important symbols of Prussian Germany had been crushed. Yet the war in East Prussia was not over. Thousands of German soldiers remained in the Samland Peninsula and along the Baltic coast. They were still trapped. Their only hope was evacuation by sea. This was when the Baltic became the final escape route. German naval vessels, merchant ships, ferries, transports, and smaller craft were pressed into service. The operation became known as Operation Hannibal. Its scale was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people would eventually be evacuated from the German Baltic territories during the final months of the war. But the sea offered no guarantee of survival. Soviet aircraft hunted the ships. Soviet submarines prowled the Baltic. The waters were crowded with vessels carrying soldiers, civilians, wounded men, children, and refugees. One of the greatest maritime disasters of the war occurred during this desperate evacuation. On January 30th, 1945, the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff was struck by 3 torpedoes fired by the Soviet submarine S-13. The ship sank rapidly. Thousands died. Most were civilians and refugees, including many children. The disaster became a horrifying symbol of the catastrophe unfolding across the Baltic, and it was not the only ship lost. On February 10th, the General von Steuben was sunk by the same Soviet submarine. Thousands more died. Then, on April 16th, the Goya was torpedoed. Again, thousands perished. The Baltic Sea, which refugees had imagined as their path to safety, had become another battlefield. But despite the danger, the evacuation continued. Ships arrived. People crowded aboard. Wounded, soldiers were carried up gangways. Children were passed from hand to hand. Families clung to whatever possessions they had managed to save. Some ships left so overloaded that there was barely room to move. Yet the alternative was worse: remain in East Prussia and face the advancing Red Army. By the final weeks of the war, organized German resistance in the region was collapsing. The Soviet forces had destroyed the possibility of restoring a land connection with Germany. German units became isolated pockets. Some surrendered. Others attempted to break through. Some continued fighting until their ammunition ran out. There was no longer any realistic possibility of victory, only survival. The German army had entered East Prussia, believing it was defending the birthplace of Prussian military power. It ended the campaign surrounded, shattered, and desperately trying to escape by sea. The civilians suffered an equally catastrophic fate. Hundreds of thousands fled. Many were evacuated. Many were killed during the fighting, bombardments, or the desperate winter flight. Others were separated from their families, and countless lives were permanently uprooted. The old East Prussia was disappearing. The military defeat was complete. The province that Hitler had refused to abandon had been transformed into a battlefield. Its cities were destroyed, its army formations shattered, its population scattered, and the political world that had created Prussia was about to disappear forever. But perhaps the most important lesson of the East Prussian disaster was not the size of the Soviet army. It was the danger of refusing reality. Hitler had been warned. His commanders had seen the threat. The geography itself made the danger obvious. East Prussia projected deep into territory controlled by the Soviet Union. Once the Red Army broke through and reached the Baltic, the province could be isolated. And that is exactly what happened. The fortress became a trap. The soldiers ordered to defend it became prisoners of geography. The civilians who had trusted the Wehrmacht to protect them became refugees. And the roads intended to connect East Prussia with Germany became corridors of death. By May 1945, Nazi Germany itself was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. The Wehrmacht was surrendering. The Second World War in Europe was ending. But for those who had lived through the East Prussian catastrophe, the war did not end with a simple announcement. They had lost homes, families, comrades, cities, an entire homeland. The map of Europe was being redrawn. East Prussia, once the proud heart of Prussian power, would no longer exist as it had before the war. And the men who had been told that the fortress would never fall had learned the terrible truth on the frozen roads of 1945. Fortresses can fall. Armies can be destroyed. And when leaders refuse to retreat from a battlefield that can no longer be defended, the soldiers and civilians trapped inside may pay the price with everything they have. The East Prussian trap was not simply the story of a German defeat. It was the story of an entire world collapsing beneath artillery, fire, snow, and fear. And when the guns finally fell silent, East Prussia was no longer the place Hitler had promised to defend. It was a graveyard of an old Europe,